Jacob was the type of man who kept to himself. Solitude was his comfort, and the forest was where he found it. He wasn't out looking for anything special that day, just clearing his head with a hike. But when he stumbled upon the lantern, something about it made him stop. Half buried in a bed of leaves, the old brass lantern seemed out of place, its surface weathered but still intact. Strange markings covered the metal symbols he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, Jacob knelt and brushed the dirt from its sides. It felt heavier than it looked. The glass panel was intact, and inside, a wick sat untouched, as if waiting for someone to light it again. Why was it here? Who left it? Jacob shook his head, dismissing the questions. It didn't matter. He grabbed the lantern, thinking it would make an interesting piece for his shelf back home, and continued his walk, not noticing how the forest seemed to grow quieter as he left. That evening, as dusk settled over his small cabin, Jacob found himself staring at the lantern on his table. He couldn't explain it, but something about the object felt off. It wasn't just the odd markings. It was the way it seemed to almost hum in the silence of his home, as if it was calling out to him. His curiosity won over. With a match in hand, Jacob struck it and brought the flame to the lantern's wick. As soon as the flame touched, the room seemed to tremble. The lantern's glass flared to life with a sickly green glow, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. And then he saw them. At first, they were faint outlines, barely more than wisps of smoke drifting near the edge of the light. But then, they grew clearer, solidifying into forms. Faces emerged, pale, gaunt, with eyes full of sorrow. There were at least 5 of them, floating silently in his living room, their mouths open as if they were screaming, though no sound escaped. Jacob staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed the lantern, ready to smash it, but then one of the figures moved forward, a woman, her face twisted in pain. "Please," she whispered, her voice soft but desperate. "Help us." The others began to follow her lead, drifting closer, their faces full of agony, their hands reaching out. Jacob dropped the lantern, the light flickering but not extinguishing. He scrambled back, his body pressing against the wall as the room grew colder, the air thick with something dark and ancient. The spirits crowded around the lantern, but none of them stepped out of its glow. They were bound to it, tied to its flickering light. "Help us," the woman repeated, her hollow eyes locked onto his. "You have to help us." Jacob's mind raced. Help them? How? What did they want? He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His hand shook as he reached for the lantern, extinguishing the flame with trembling fingers. In an instant, the room went dark. The temperature warmed, and the oppressive weight of the spirits vanished. Jacob stood there, panting in the silence, the lantern now nothing more than a lifeless object on his floor. But he knew the truth. Something terrible was tied to it. And whatever it wasn't done with him yet. The lantern sat there, as if waiting to be lit again. Jacob hadn't slept. The strange events from the night before replayed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't shake. The spirits, their hollow eyes, their pleas, none of it made sense. He hadn't touched the lantern since, but it was still there, sitting on the table, as if daring him to light it again. By mid-morning, Jacob couldn't take it anymore. He had to know what was happening. Against his better judgment, he picked up the lantern. It felt cold, unnaturally so. His fingers trembled as he struck a match and brought it to the wick. The moment the flame caught, the same sickly green glow flooded the room, and the figures appeared again. Faded at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. They hovered around the lantern, trapped in its light. One spirit, the woman from the night before, floated closer, her face more sorrowful than before. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "You must help us." Jacob swallowed hard. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The woman's form flickered, and for a moment, she looked more human. Her hair flowing as if caught in a gentle breeze, her pale skin almost lifelike. "My name is Eliza," she said. "I died in these woods long ago. The lantern, it shows those of us who are trapped. We cannot move on." Jacob's heart raced. "Why me?" "I don't know how to help you." Eliza drifted closer, her hollow eyes locked onto his. "You found the lantern. Only the one who lights it can set us free." Jacob took a step back, shaking his head. "Free you? How? I don't even understand what's happening." "The lantern reveals those who died nearby," Eliza explained, her voice filled with desperation. "We are bound to the place of our deaths, our souls trapped in an endless loop of pain. We need you to find our bodies, bury us properly. Only then can we be free." Jacob's mind raced. He didn't know whether to believe her or smash the lantern and run. But something about Eliza's plea stirred something in him. She wasn't just a ghost. There was a deep sadness in her voice, a desperation he couldn't ignore. He rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of it all. "So, if I help you, if I bury your body, you'll leave me alone?" Eliza nodded, her face softening. "Yes, I will be free, and so will you." Jacob hesitated. He wanted to say no, to extinguish the lantern and forget any of this ever happened. But the weight of her sorrow bore down on him, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. Where are you buried?" he asked. "I don't know," Eliza whispered, "but it's close. You must search the woods where you found the lantern. I'm sure my body is there, somewhere." Jacob exhaled slowly. The spirits around Eliza remained silent, watching him with sunken, pleading eyes. He felt their desperation too. Could he really do this? Did he even want to get involved? But the weight of their presence hung in the air, pressing on his chest like an invisible force. "I'll try," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "But I'm not making any promises." Eliza's form flickered again, her smile faint but genuine. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Jacob extinguished the lantern once more. The room plunged into silence, but the feeling of their presence lingered. He sat down heavily on the chair, his head spinning. He knew what he had to do, but dread washed over him. The forest had always been a place of peace for him, but now it had become something darker, a graveyard filled with lost souls. And one way or another, he was about to dig into it. Jacob had always felt at home in the woods, but today, the trees felt like sentinels, their branches twisted and ominous. The air was thick with tension, as if the forest knew what he was there to do. The lantern, now cold and dark, hung from his hand as he retraced his steps from the day he found it. The weight of Eliza's plea sat heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. A grave, bones, a sign of some long-forgotten tragedy. All he knew was that he needed to find her resting place and free her, or the spirits would never leave him alone. Every step felt like a journey deeper into the unknown. The forest was dense, and even in daylight, the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. Jacob kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the spirits to appear, even though the lantern wasn't lit. As he reached the spot where he first discovered the lantern, a sudden chill washed over him. The trees swayed, though there was no wind, and the air felt unnaturally cold. Jacob's fingers twitched as he raised the lantern, preparing to light it. With a flick of a match, the sickly green light flared to life, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Almost immediately, the spirits reappeared, hovering around him, their expressions full of torment and sorrow. Eliza was at the forefront, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "This is where I died," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thrum of the forest. "I can feel it." Jacob swallowed hard. "Where exactly? I don't see anything." Eliza's form flickered, growing more transparent. "You must dig," she said, pointing to the ground near a cluster of overgrown bushes. I was buried here. Forgotten. Jacob stared at the ground, his heart hammering. He didn't have a shovel, just his hands and the growing sense of dread. Reluctantly, he knelt and began to dig, the dirt cold and loose beneath his fingers. Each handful of earth felt like it was dragging him closer to something he didn't want to face. Minutes passed, and then his fingers brushed against something hard, wood, old, and splintered. His pulse quickened as he cleared more dirt away, revealing what looked like a small wooden box. His stomach churned. Was this Eliza's grave? A makeshift coffin, hidden for years? Suddenly, the spirits around him began to stir, their forms flickering wildly as if in response to what he was uncovering. Eliza's face twisted in pain, and the other spirits began to drift closer, their hollow eyes wide with fear. "Please, be careful," Eliza said, her voice strained. "There are others. They don't want us to be free." Jacob's blood ran cold. He glanced at the spirits surrounding him, and for the first time, he noticed something different. Among the sorrowful faces were darker figures, twisted, malevolent shapes that seemed to blend with the shadows. Their eyes burned with anger, their mouths curled into silent snarls. Jacob's hands froze over the box. What are they? Eliza's form shimmered. They are the ones who were cursed. Like me, but they were consumed by it. They feed on the souls trapped in the lantern. If we free me, they will try to stop us. Jacob felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. What do I do? You must finish this, Eliza whispered, but be quick. They're growing stronger. Jacob's hands moved faster, scraping away the dirt, exposing the wooden box fully. The spirits grew more restless, their movements becoming erratic. The darker ones edged closer, their twisted faces full of malice. The air grew colder, and Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps. With a final pull, he yanked the box from the earth, the wood crumbling in his hands. Inside was a small, decayed skeleton, wrapped in tattered cloth. Eliza's form flickered, her eyes wide with both relief and fear. "You found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But you must bury me properly, or I'll never be free." Jacob nodded, his hands shaking as he placed the box on the ground. But before he could begin to dig a proper grave, the darker spirits surged forward, their faces twisted in rage. The air around him grew thick with their presence, and Jacob could feel their icy fingers brushing against his skin. His heart pounded. He had to hurry, or they would tear him apart. With frantic movements, Jacob began to dig, his hands moving faster and faster, tossing dirt aside as the malevolent spirits closed in. They hissed silently, their forms writhing as if they were fighting against an invisible force. Eliza's form flickered wildly, her eyes full of fear. "Please, don't stop," she pleaded. But the dark spirits were too close now, their twisted hands reaching for Jacob. Just as he was about to falter, he dug deep enough, creating a space large enough for the box. With trembling hands, he placed the skeleton in the ground and began to cover it with dirt. The moment the last handful of earth hit the ground, the air changed. The dark spirits shrieked, their forms dissolving into the wind. Eliza's ghostly figure smiled, a soft light glowing around her as she began to fade. "Thank you," she whispered. "You freed me." Jacob collapsed to the ground, his body shaking with exhaustion. The lantern's glow dimmed, and for the first time in days, the forest felt quiet. But deep down, Jacob knew this wasn't over. He had freed one soul, but there were others. And the lantern was still in his hand, its eerie light waiting for him to light it once more. Jacob had barely slept after freeing Eliza. The weight of her gratitude still clung to him, but so did the realization that the lantern was far from ordinary. What disturbed him more was the thought that there were other spirits, and some weren't as peaceful as Eliza. The malevolent ones had almost killed him, and the lantern, It seemed to grow heavier in his hand, like it carried the burden of all the souls it had trapped over the years. The following day, Jacob set out for town. He needed answers. He had spent years in solitude, but now he had to reach out, dig into the history of the lantern and the forest it had come from. There had to be something that explained the markings, the spirits, and why the lantern had ended up in the woods. The local library was old and dusty, a relic of a town that didn't care much for its past. Jacob flipped through old records, newspaper clippings, and faded maps, trying to find anything that mentioned mysterious deaths in the woods or the lantern itself. Hours passed, and just when his frustration was about to boil over, he found something. An article from the late 1800s, yellowed and torn, caught his attention. The headline read, "Mystery Lantern Found in the Woods After Family Disappearance." The article described a family who had lived near the forest, 2 parents and their young daughter, who had vanished without a trace. Their bodies were never found, but the only thing left behind was an old brass lantern, much like the one Jacob had discovered. The locals believed the family had been cursed. Jacob's heart pounded. There was more to the story. He followed the trail, finding more fragmented reports of disappearances throughout the years, all tied to the same woods. The people were different, but the pattern was the same. Each case involved a lantern, always found near the site of the disappearance, as if it was drawing people in. He stumbled upon a final article, one that chilled him to his core. It described a ritual ancient and forbidden. The lantern, it seemed, had been crafted by someone who had committed atrocities, using it to bind souls to the place of their death. The purpose wasn't just to trap spirits, it was to control them. The lantern was a tool of power, and anyone who used it became its keeper, bound to serve it. Jacob leaned back in his chair, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The lantern wasn't just cursed. It was designed to collect souls. Elijah had been one of many, and if he kept using the lantern, the burden would only grow. More spirits would come, and eventually they would overwhelm him. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see an old man shuffling toward him, his face creased with age and wisdom. The librarian, Jacob assumed. The man gave him a long, knowing look before speaking. "You found it, haven't you?" The librarian asked, his voice raspy and tired. Jacob's blood ran cold. "Found what?" "The lantern," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "It's been missing for years. I've seen many people come through this library looking for answers, just like you. They never come back." Jacob stiffened. "What do you know about it?" The old man sighed and sat down across from Jacob, his frail hands clasped together. "That lantern was made to trap the dead. It's tied to this town, to the people who lived here long ago. Every time it reappears, it brings tragedy. Those who find it, they're never the same. You can't just cast it aside. It chooses you, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." Jacob swallowed hard, his mind spinning. What does it want? The librarian leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "It wants you to carry its burden. The spirits inside are drawn to it because they can't move on. But it doesn't care about helping them. It feeds on them, and eventually it will feed on you too." Jacob's skin crawled. "How do I get rid of it?" The old man shook his head slowly. "You can't. You're the keeper now. The only way to free yourself is to destroy it. But doing that, it'll cost you. The spirits won't let you go easily." Jacob clenched his fists, the weight of the lantern seeming to grow heavier with every word. He had already seen what the spirits could do, the malevolent ones, the angry ones. If he destroyed the lantern, would they come for him? The old man stood, his expression grim. "Be careful. That lantern has claimed many before you. Don't let it take your soul too." Jacob watched as the librarian shuffled away, the warning echoing in his mind. He knew now what the lantern was, but knowing didn't make things any easier. The spirits were still trapped, and they would keep coming to him, begging for help. If he couldn't free them all, they would haunt him until he was one of them. As Jacob left the library, the lantern felt like a lead weight in his hand. He had a choice to make. Either keep carrying the burden, risking his life and sanity, or destroy the lantern and face whatever terrible consequences followed. He wasn't sure which was worse. The lantern sat heavy in Jacob's hands as he trudged back through the forest, its cold brass a constant reminder of the curse he now carried. The librarian's words echoed in his mind. It wants you to carry its burden. It feeds on them. It will feed on you too. Jacob's breath came in short bursts. He had thought freeing Eliza would be the end, but now he understood it was only the beginning. The lantern didn't care about the spirits. It wanted to trap them, and if he wasn't careful, it would claim him as well. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jacob hesitated at the door, the lantern clutched tightly in his hand. His mind raced with possibilities. He could smash it now, bury it deep in the ground, or even throw it into the lake nearby. But the librarian had been clear. Destroying it would come at a cost he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. Inside the cabin, Jacob set the lantern on the table and stared at it for what felt like hours. He couldn't leave it lit. The spirits would come again, and he didn't know how many were left or how dangerous they might be. But he couldn't leave it dark either. The curse wasn't just about the spirits. It was tied to him now. He could feel it in his bones, like a shadow looming just out of sight. His fingers hovered over the wick, torn between lighting it and leaving it cold. He needed answers, more than what the librarian had given him. If he was going to survive this, he had to understand exactly what the lantern wanted, what the spirits were after. With a resigned breath, Jacob struck a match and lit the lantern. The greenish light flared to life, casting eerie shadows on the walls. At first, there was silence, and then they appeared. The spirits fainted first, but growing clearer, their faces filled with the same desperation he'd seen before. But this time, there were more of them. Dozens. Some wept quietly. Others reached out with twisted, claw-like hands. Eliza wasn't among them. Jacob took a step back, his pulse quickening. The air grew colder, the room tightening with their presence. One of the spirits, an older man with sunken eyes, floated closer. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. It was a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down Jacob's spine. "You, carry the lantern." The spirit rasped, its face distorted with pain. "We are bound, but you can free us." Jacob swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "How? How do I free you?" The spirit's hollow eyes locked onto his. "You cannot escape it." Jacob's stomach twisted. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for any of this." The other spirits began to move closer, their voices overlapping in a whispering chorus of pleas and cries. Their forms flickered like candle flames in the wind, distorted and unstable. Suddenly, a different voice cut through the chaos, deeper and more menacing. "You are the keeper now." Jacob's blood ran cold. A new figure emerged from the shadows, taller and more solid than the others. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes burned with a sinister glow. This spirit wasn't like the others. It wasn't pleading for help. It was something else, something more dangerous. "The lantern belongs to you," the figure hissed, its voice like the grinding of stone. "You will carry its curse until the end." Jacob took a step back, his heart racing. "I didn't choose this. I don't want this." The figure's form flickered, and in an instant, it was inches from Jacob's face, its cold breath chilling his skin. "It does not matter what you want. You lit the lantern. You are bound to it now." Jacob's pulse quickened. "I'll destroy it." The figure let out a low, guttural laugh. "Destroy it, and you will pay the price." Your soul will be bound forever, just like ours." The room grew darker, the lantern's light flickering wildly. The other spirits seemed to fade into the background as the figure loomed over Jacob, its presence suffocating. He could feel the weight of the lantern in his hand, its power pressing down on him, consuming him. The figure's voice lowered to a menacing whisper. "The lantern feeds on us. It will feed on you too. You cannot run from it. You cannot hide." Jacob's hand shook as he gripped the lantern tighter. His thoughts raced, torn between fear and desperation. He didn't want to be trapped, didn't want to end up like them. But what choice did he have? The figure stepped back, its eyes glowing with malice. "You are the keeper now. The lantern will claim your soul, unless you feed it." Jacob's stomach churned. Feed it? What does that mean? The figure's form began to fade, its voice echoing as it disappeared. "You must find another to take your place." The lantern's glow dimmed, and the spirits faded, leaving Jacob alone in the darkness. Jacob stood there, the weight of the lantern dragging him down. He had thought freeing Eliza would lift the curse, but now he understood the terrible truth. The lantern wasn't just a tool. It was a trap, and the only way out was to pass the burden on to someone else. But could he do that? Could he really condemn someone else to this fate? As he stared at the lantern's fading light, a horrifying thought crossed his mind. If he didn't find a way out soon, the lantern would feed on him. And when it was done, he would become just another lost soul trapped in its cursed glow. Jacob sat at his kitchen table, the lantern's dull greenish glow barely illuminating the room. His mind raced, haunted by the words of the malevolent spirit from the night before. "You must find another to take your place." The thought sickened him. He couldn't imagine passing this curse on to someone else, but the alternative, letting the lantern consume him, was worse. The spirits had been quiet since that night, but Jacob knew it wouldn't last. They would come back, and with each passing moment, the lantern's grip on him tightened. He could feel it in the air around him, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, the cold that never quite left the room. He needed a solution, and fast. There was only one place left to go. The librarian had mentioned that the lantern had claimed many souls before him. If anyone knew how to break the curse, it would be the descendants of those who had first created it. Jacob had found their names in the old records. An old, forgotten family that lived on the outskirts of town, the ones who had disappeared long ago. With a heavy heart and the lantern tucked into his bag, Jacob set out toward the old estate. The journey was short, but felt like an eternity, the forest looming on either side of the narrow road. The trees, once comforting, now felt like they were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. When he finally reached the estate, it was just as he had imagined. A crumbling, decaying mansion, long abandoned by time. But there was light inside. Jacob's pulse quickened as he approached the front door, his hand trembling as he knocked. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a frail, elderly man with piercing eyes. His face was wrinkled, but his gaze was sharp, as if he had been waiting for Jacob all along. "I've been expecting you," the old man said in a rasping voice, stepping aside to let Jacob in. Jacob hesitated before stepping across the threshold, his eyes scanning the dark, musty interior of the mansion. The air smelled of decay, and the furniture was covered in thick layers of dust. But the old man's eyes were what unsettled him the most. There was a depth of knowledge in them, as if he knew everything about the curse Jacob now carried. "You know about the lantern," Jacob said, his voice flat, barely concealing his fear. The old man nodded slowly, his thin lips curling into a grim smile. "I know more than you can imagine. It's been in my family for centuries. It has claimed us all, one by one." Jacob tightened his grip on the lantern inside his bag. "I need to break the curse. I can't." He paused, his voice catching in his throat. I can't pass it on to someone else." The old man chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Of course not. The lantern feeds on the soul of its keeper. If you pass it on, you might spare yourself, but the next poor soul will face the same fate." "There has to be another way," Jacob pleaded, his desperation growing. "Tell me how to destroy it." The old man's expression darkened, and for a moment, Jacob saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or regret. "Destroying it will set the souls free," he said, his voice low. "But it comes with a cost. The lantern's power is bound to the soul of its keeper. If you destroy it, the souls will go free. Yes, but so will yours." Jacob's heart sank. "What does that mean?" The old man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "It means you'll die. The moment the lantern is broken, your soul will be torn from your body, just like the spirits it holds. You'll join them, trapped in the place where the lantern was found." Jacob staggered back, his mind spinning. Destroy the lantern and free the spirits, but at the cost of his own life? Or live with the curse, knowing it would eventually consume him, or worse, someone else? He gripped the lantern tighter, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't chosen to carry this burden, but now it was on him, and he had to decide. The spirits deserved freedom. Eliza, the others. They had suffered long enough, but was he willing to pay the ultimate price? "You have to decide," the old man said quietly, watching Jacob wrestle with the weight of the choice. Jacob's hand shook as he lifted the lantern from his bag and placed it on the table between them. Its eerie green light flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The spirits were silent for now, but he could feel their presence, waiting, watching. "How do I do it?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man reached into his coat and pulled out a small iron hammer, its surface rusted with age. He placed it on the table beside the lantern, his eyes never leaving Jacob's. "One strike. That's all it takes. Once you break the glass, the lantern's power will shatter and the spirits will be free." Jacob stared at the hammer, his heart pounding in his chest. His life, his future, everything hung in the balance of this moment. He could feel the cold tendrils of the lantern's curse wrapping tighter around him, pulling him closer to its inevitable end. With a deep breath, Jacob picked up the hammer. The weight of it felt final, like the closing of a door. The old man watched in silence, his eyes full of grim understanding. "You have to be ready," he said softly. "Once it's done, there's no going back." Jacob looked at the lantern, its sickly green light pulsing gently, and he thought of Eliza, the souls, the terror he had felt since lighting it for the first time. He couldn't let this curse continue, not for himself, not for anyone else. His grip tightened on the hammer, and with a final, determined breath, he brought it down. The glass shattered instantly. The room exploded with light as the lantern's power tore free, a gust of wind howling through the house. The spirits screamed, their forms dissolving into mist as they were released from their eternal prison. Jacob felt a sharp, searing pain in his chest, as if his very soul was being ripped apart. He gasped, staggering backward, his vision blurring as the light consumed everything. As the last of the spirits faded into the ether, Jacob collapsed to the floor, the lantern's shattered remains lying beside him. His body grew cold, his vision dimming. The curse was broken, the souls were free, and soon so would he be. In the quiet of the broken mansion, Jacob exhaled his final breath, his soul drifting into the place where the lantern's power had once held sway. The mansion was silent now, the air thick with the finality of what Jacob had done. His body lay crumpled on the floor, the shattered remnants of the lantern scattered around him. The spirits were gone, freed from their torment, released from the prison of the lantern. The greenish glow that once filled the room had vanished, leaving only the dim light of dusk filtering through the dirty windows. But Jacob wasn't truly gone. He drifted in a space between worlds, weightless and untethered. His body no longer felt like his own, but his consciousness lingered. He could feel the pull of the lantern's curse still clinging to him, even though the object itself was destroyed. The spirits had been freed, but the cost was his soul, just as the old man had warned. In this liminal space, Jacob could see flashes of the spirits he had released. Their faces no longer twisted in agony, but peaceful, grateful. Eliza was among them, her smile faint but real, a lightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice carried on a breeze that felt both near and distant. But Jacob couldn't respond. His voice, his body, his very self. Everything was dissolving, fading into the space where the lost souls had once been trapped. He wasn't bound to the lantern anymore, but the curse had claimed him. He felt it drawing him back to where it had all begun. The forest. The world around him shifted. In an instant, Jacob found himself standing at the edge of the clearing where he had first discovered the lantern. The trees were tall and dark, casting long shadows across the ground. The forest seemed to hum with an eerie, unnatural energy, as if it remembered him. Jacob looked down at his hands, but they were no longer solid. He was a ghost now, just like the spirits he had tried to free. His form flickered, translucent, barely holding together. He felt a deep, crushing loneliness settle over him. He had done the right thing, but this was the price. As he drifted through the clearing, a figure emerged from the trees. T was the old man from the mansion, his frail form moving slowly but deliberately toward Jacob. His eyes, sharp and knowing, were no longer filled with pity. Instead, they gleamed with something darker. "You didn't really think it was over, did you?" the old man said, his voice carrying a cold edge. "The lantern may be gone, but the curse lives on." Jacob's chest tightened with dread. "I destroyed it," he said, his voice echoing like a faint breeze. "The spirits are free." The old man shook his head slowly, a twisted smile creeping across his face. "The spirits, yes. But the lantern wasn't just a prison for them. It was a tool, passed down through generations, designed to bind those who used it. You destroyed the lantern, Jacob, but its power has always been in the curse itself. And now that curse is yours." Jacob felt a cold wave of realization crash over him. The curse hadn't been broken. It had simply changed. The spirits were free, but he was now bound to the place where the lantern had first claimed its victims. He had become part of the cycle, just another lost soul wandering the forest. "You'll roam this place now," the old man continued, his voice dripping with malice, "just as the others did. You may have saved them, but you've condemned yourself." Jacob's form flickered again, his body growing weaker with each passing moment. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but his voice was swallowed by the forest. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, and he realized, with horrifying clarity, that he had never truly escaped the lantern's curse. He had merely traded one prison for another. The old man's eyes gleamed. "And soon, someone else will find this place. Another poor soul, just like you, drawn to the darkness. They'll pick up where you left off, and the cycle will continue." Jacob's mind raced. He had to do something, anything, to stop this. He couldn't let the curse claim another victim. But he was powerless, a mere shadow of who he had been. He drifted aimlessly through the clearing, the forest closing in around him. As the old man disappeared into the woods, his laughter echoed through the trees, a haunting reminder that Jacob's struggle was far from over. And then, in the distance, Jacob saw it. A flicker of movement, a figure approaching the clearing. A traveler. The man's footsteps were slow, hesitant, as if he sensed something was wrong. He paused at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the ground. Jacob's heart pounded, though he no longer had a body to feel it. He knew what was coming. He knew the lantern's curse was about to claim its next victim. The traveler crouched down, brushing away the leaves to reveal the broken shards of the lantern. His fingers hovered over the pieces, curiosity lighting up his face. Jacob wanted to scream, to warn him, but no sound escaped. He was trapped, a helpless observer as the cycle began again. The traveler's hand reached out, closing around one of the shards. The moment he touched it, the air around them shifted, the same cold, eerie chill that Jacob had felt when he first lit the lantern. The curse was awakening, ready to claim its next soul. Jacob watched, powerless, as the traveler stood, the shard of the lantern clutched in his hand. The forest seemed to close in around them both, and Jacob knew, with a sinking feeling, that the cycle would never end. The lantern's light may have been extinguished, but its curse would live on. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.